was this girl who had a recurring nightmare. Every night, she'd be in bed, sleeping, and all of a sudden, the door to her room would open, unveiling the shadow of a person standing there, looking at her. And she would always wake up before she could see that person's face. And she'd be very afraid. So one morning, she woke up and ran to her mother to tell her about that terrifying dream she'd been having. And her mother listened quietly and then asked her, "So you've never gotten to see that person's face, have you?" So the daughter said, "No, haven't, Mom." And then her mother said, "But you're afraid something terrible is about to happen to you." And so the daughter replied, "Yes, Mom, very afraid." And finally, the mother said, "What if something good is about to happen?" And she sat there for a second and thought about it because you see, it hadn't occurred to her, not even for a second, that the end of that terrifying dream could be a good one. So that night, she went to bed and fell asleep and started dreaming again. And all of a sudden, the door to her room opened, unveiling the shadow of a person standing there. Except this time, the shadow started walking towards her. And as it got closer, she recognized his face. That shadow actually was her estranged father, who had come home from a very long business trip and was just dying to kiss his daughter goodnight. Our thoughts, our perceptions, our fears, they can control us. They can cripple us even. Or we can confront them, challenge them, and eventually break free from them. My name is Hannane Ferdjani. As Eric said, I'm a journalist and I'm very passionate about my job. And I want to share a little bit about my story and my journey with you up to this point. I was born in Niger, this big desert-filled country in West Africa that people outside of the continent either don't know or get mixed up with Nigeria. My father was Algerian, the man who raised me, my other father from Mali, and my mother from Niger. And as a child, I lived in Algeria, in Niger, in Guinea, and Burkina Faso, all before the age of 12. And as an adult, I took my nomadic predispositions, if I can call them that, to a whole new level as I resided in France, China, France again, then China again, then South Africa, then I went to the UK, then back to France, then I went to Africa, Ivory Coast, and more recently, the Congo. But regardless of the place, the city, the country, the continent I have found myself in, people have subconsciously or consciously, for that matter, attempted to put me in a box. A box I felt did not reflect the complexity of the person that I am. In France and China, for instance, I've often been the one black girl in the office, having to speak for all minorities when debates about diversity and African culture would arise. Whereas in Western Africa, in Francophone countries, I'm often considered a Westerner because when I speak French, my native tongue, is with that white accent that I simply acquired at French school. The preconceived notions, the prejudice, they used to affect me. But I've learned that, in the words of Marcus Aurelius, if you are pained by external things, it is not that they disturb you, but your own judgment of them. And it is in your power to wipe out that judgment now. What this phrase essentially means is that circumstances and opinions, they do not matter. What matters is our perceptions of said opinions and circumstances and our ability to change that perception. What matters is that we decide to not confine ourselves in the borders of our minds, because those mind-numbing, constricting borders, the walls that we've pretty much accepted as fatality, we can break them. And they often keep us from embracing our true selves, and reaching our fullest potential. For me, it began with family. My parents have, in the past, put me in a box. They had their very own idea of the kind of person I should be, the kind of career I should take on. You know, as most parents do, they fantasize about serious careers and my financial security and stability. And then there's also that voice in their head that kept whispering over and over and over again, this girl, she keeps going from this country to that country, from that challenge to this challenge, but is she even thinking about marriage? I know that some people may be able to relate to this one, marriage and African parents. That's a very important thing. Um, but I was 14 when I started dreaming about becoming a journalist. I would watch Christiane Amanpour's reports on CNN and think to myself, this could be me one day. But in most conversations I would have with people, I would say I wanted to be a lawyer. It made sense at the time, you know, because I wasn't really aware of what a lawyer actually does for a living. And you know, in American TV shows, it always looks very cool, the theatrical, epic closing arguments. I thought that's what a lawyer was about. But by the time I graduated from high school, I knew it really wasn't what I was about. So I moved to southern France and I still went with law studies. It fits in my parents' box and it fit in my 18-year-old self box. But by year 2, I hated it. I could not stand the idea of being a lawyer. I could not stand the studies. And it dawned upon me, I had always wanted to become a journalist. So now I just had to be one. Now, let's be real, just because you decide on something and you want it very badly doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight. As cliche as a reference as this may be, Oprah Winfrey did not become the media mogul and brand that she is overnight. As a matter of fact, Oprah Winfrey's first job as an anchor, that was on ABC, her first show, it tanked, and she was regarded as a source of its failure. So the road towards one's goal is often a rocky path with obstacles along the way. And since I've taken on my journey, I've come across oases and mountains, valleys and plain fields. I've had to take muddy deviations only to encounter unexpected shortcuts. For instance, I've been an intern more times than I should have. I've made photocopies, I've brought coffee to anchors, I've been subjected to ridiculous whim and tantrums. I remember this one time, my first job in television in Paris, actually, there was a problem with the software that we used, so I wasn't able to print the script for my presenter. And that woman went crazy, hysterical on me, and simply assumed that I was not bright enough to know how to press print on a computer. So, you know, I'm still talking about it today because I haven't gotten over it. It really, really hurt my ego. But yeah, I've had dry spells early on in my career. Moments you feel you're on the sidelines of the action, not doing anything meaningful, or not actually fulfilling your purpose. Boniface Mwangi, he's an activist and an international photographer, but based in Kenya, and he described a similar feeling that he experienced in a TED Talk he did a few years ago that I really appreciated. He said that there was a time he finally decided to stop being a smart coward, as they call it, and speak up against the rampant corruption and violence in his country. So him and his friends, they were going to go and heckle at a public mass meeting and just speak up against that. Now, when the day came, none of his friends showed up. He was alone, and he had a choice: be a coward or be brave. And guess what? He still stood up for what he believed in, despite the fears and the failure. He did. Now, back to me. In 2015, I was on a short-term text producing contract in Paris for a renowned international channel. And at the same time, in Niger, in southern Niger, my country, Boko Haram, the terrorist group, was gaining grounds and slowly but surely destroying the Chad Basin's region. So I naturally wanted to cover that story. I wanted to go beyond the headlines, beyond the death tolls. I wanted to see what was going on there firsthand. But the problem was that I was not on the station's reporters list. You know, there's reporters and then there's text producers, and you can't really go from one to another. That's not how it works in journalism. So I could not really do it because it didn't matter that I spoke the language, that it was my country, and that I had the connections. No one was going to commission the story, and no one was going to commission me. So, out of despair, I think, and frustration more than bravery, I took some of the money I had on the side. I hopped on a plane. I went to Niger, and with the help of an uncle in the military, I got embedded with the army. Now, mind you, I had no experience in war and crisis reporting. I don't know if you see me here. I don't look really tough, and I'm even told by certain people that I'm precious. Um, so it was a bit of a risk. My family was mortified. But I traveled along the border with Nigeria, and I visited villages. I spoke to soldiers, refugees, traders, farmers, people who had been deeply affected by this crisis. I tried to compile their stories, and I went back to Paris and pitched my story. And guess what? My credentials did not matter anymore, and the story was broadcast. Today, I work for a Pan-African. Thank you. Thank you. Today, I work for a Pan-African news channel that some of you may know. I'm not going to say the name because I don't know if you can. And I co-host a news morning show, which basically means beyond the glamour of being on television that I go to bed before sunset every night. I wake up at 1 a.m. while all of you are sleeping, and that I have no social life whatsoever. So, but more importantly, what's interesting is that it took me months before I felt like I belonged on that set and like I belonged on the chair of that studio. Let's say I had some very humble beginnings. I stumbled on every other word. I was crippled by fear. I could not talk. I was not a natural. Was not a given for me. So it wasn't until my mother, who now watches my show religiously, she's one of my biggest fans, she called me one day and told me, "Do you realize how much you've grown as a presenter? You finally command that stage now." That I realized that, well, it's true. I do feel like I command it, and I realized how far I'd come. Today, I'm not nowhere near being the woman I aspire to be. I haven't affected the change that I want to affect. You know, in this era of digital journalism and citizen journalism, the era of fake news and alternative facts, I couldn't help but not take a jab at Donald Trump. I can't help it. In this era, I really want to be someone who makes journalism that's reliable. I want to incite good governance and accountability in Africa and beyond. I'm not quite there yet. But if my little experience has taught me anything, it's when I'm pushing against my limitations, my intellectual limitations, going against my fears and exploring those borders, that I'm getting closer and closer to the person and the best version of myself. Now, you've heard this before. It's not a new message, I know that. But revolutionaries like Burkina Faso's Thomas Sankara and Mali's Sheikh Modibo Keïta, they did not come to inspire generations by giving into oppression and circumstances and hardship. Nigeria's Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she did not become one of the strongest female voices of our time by being idle and staying in her lane. There's a designer I really like from Ivory Coast, actually. Her name is Loza Maleombo, and her designs, they were put in Beyonce's Lemonade film. That's a big deal, because they were a true reflection of herself. Weird, flamboyant, and unique. So I encourage you to not confine yourself in the borders of your mind, to forget the fact that you think that those walls cannot be broken, because they can. They can. They're being broken every day by people that you know and people that you don't know. I encourage you to fight against your fears. Of course, everyone is afraid of failure. We're all afraid that something terrible is going to happen, that we're not going to make it. It's the most natural thing because circumstances are difficult and people are telling us that we can't do things. But really, do not forget that people have done it before you and will do it after you. So if you have a purpose, go after it. It's cliche, but go after your dreams. And remember what that mother said to her daughter in that story I told you earlier. Face your shadow. Something bad could happen, yes, but what if something good is about to happen? Thank you very much.